this series is conceptual engineering. How does what I want to talk about link to that? I'm going to say a little bit about that. There is a minimal sense in which what I'm doing in my work is conceptual engineering. Firstly, I carve out concepts, sometimes new ones, for the purposes of describing phenomena in the world. And secondly, my work is motivated by social justice concerns. But this minimal sense puts aside a key component of conceptual engineering, and that is that the main task at hand concerns concepts. That the subject matter is how we think about things and how to make it better, more just. An analogous project would be linguistic engineering, where the subject matter would be how we talk, and the aim was to help us talk in a better way, in a more just way. In both cases, there can, of course, be a story about how using concepts or language differently can contribute to making the world we live in better or more just. Nevertheless, the intervention is in the first instance at the conceptual or linguistic level, respectively. I wonder to what extent the focus on an intervention at the linguistic or at the conceptual level is a legacy of the way analytic philosophy was practiced in the latter part of the 20th century, with its focus on linguistic and conceptual analysis. Perhaps some people here at the workshop have views about that. So I leave that question out there. And I also leave the question out there, which is, to what extent conceptual engineering, with its focus on making our concepts better, really engages with the metaphysics of our world? There is a clear motivation for doing conceptual engineering or ameliorative analyses, as Haslanger, for instance, engaged in, if you are in the business of doing conceptual analysis of some sort. Because if you want to highlight some aspect of the world that perhaps is unjust or oppressive, you need a concept that focuses our attention on that part of the world. And you block a certain objection to your analysis that says that that's not how the ordinary concept is used. Because you're not providing an analysis of the ordinary concept, you're fashioning a new concept to give an analysis of phenomena in the world. Since your project, in that case, is not to analyze the ordinary concept, what are the success conditions for the analysis of phenomena in the world using the newly forged concept? It is clearly not whether the analysis rings true to the person on the street, but rather its usefulness, theoretically and in activism. Does it highlight things that have been hidden? Does it give us new ways to resist oppression and injustice? This sort of analysis stands and falls with its usefulness. If you've given up on conceptual analysis, like I have, what is it that you see yourself as doing? You don't need to worry about blocking the argument that says that that is not how the person on the street uses the concept, because you are already in the business of smithing new concepts for your theoretical use. You invent technical terms and technical concepts in the process of forming your theory of the phenomena in question. In my case, I see myself as analyzing the world we live in with the aim of finding a way to make it better. So it's not an analysis of concepts or our language, but of phenomena in the world. This involves giving theories of phenomena we live with, what they are and how they function. The aim is a description of aspects of the world that can be then used as a baseline when we want to make things better. Various aspects of the world are unjust, and the theory we offer should reflect that injustice. It should reveal the injustice. In the first instance, then, I see myself as describing the injustice we live with, not describing how the world would be were it more just. The main focus in my recent book, Categories We Live By, is the metaphysics of social categories, not the concepts, gender, race, etc., but the phenomena. Today, I'm going to talk about a certain conception of sex and gender as an instances of certain of a certain theory of social categories more generally. These are difficult and thorny issues. I'm going to suggest a certain approach to navigating some of them, and I call that Ontic Descent. So with those methodological reflections, I'm going to move on to a picture of social categories, but I'm going to give you here a lay of the land of the talk. So let me, here is the talk. Here is the structure of the talk, some methodological reflections, and is what I call the big picture. It's sort of the approach that I have. Then I have the conferralist framework that I put forward. Then I have how I apply it to gender and sex. And then I get to this sort of approach to how to approach these thorny issues in the end. Let me stop sharing. So let me offer you the big picture. Think of categories like women, men, and genderqueer, for example. These are gender categories. What is it to belong to one of these? There is a tradition in philosophy and in the various cultures we're all part of, which has it that you're a woman, say, entirely because of something about you. There are features of you that make you a woman. A lot of feminist theory and philosophy has been focused on figuring out what that thing is. For after all, we need to know who the women are if we are to end their oppression. And we get into trouble because each attempt at a definition runs into problems. We privilege one feature over another, and that is bad theoretically and politically and morally. Are you a woman because you are nurturing and caring? Are you a woman because you are perceived or imagined to have female reproductive organs? Are you a woman because you identify with a woman's social role or with feminine norms or take them as applying to you? There must be something about you that makes you a woman, darn it. So here's an idea. For the most part, it ain't about you. What do I mean? I mean that what makes you a woman or a man or genderqueer or what have you is mostly about other people. It's about other individual people to some extent, but mostly about the societal setting you find yourself in, with its values, norms, practices, and yes, material conditions. Those are the things that determine what it is possible for you to be, and other individuals and groups assign you roles in accordance with that. They are the foot soldiers who enforce the values of the social setting you find yourself in. The foot soldiers who enforce the ideology, if you will. We can cast what I'm suggesting in different ways. My preferred way is to say that gender and other social categories are deeply social. On this deeply social picture, you are a woman, not because of something about you, but because of something about other people and the society at large. It is their interests and values that place you in a category. You're a woman because other people care about features that they take you to have. And to be a woman is simply to have a certain social status in a context. This deeply social picture is most notably contrasted with the post-Bovarian feminist picture, still immensely popular today, where sex categories are natural and given, and gender categories are the social significance of sex. Gender on that picture is the way society values sex. You are of a certain gender because you have, or are taken to have, certain sex characteristics, and the society values those in particular ways. On that picture, you are of a certain gender because of something about you, your sex, or your perceived sex. But the meaning and consequences of that depend on the societal values. When we think of these categories as deeply social, the societal values dictate which features of individuals are important, and people get conferred onto them social statuses in accordance with that. The deeply social picture opens up yet other ways of taking a critical stance towards the world we live in. On this picture, society may value certain bodily features over others, and people get conferred statuses in accordance with that. We can then question that these features are valued in the way that they are. We can question the content of the conferred roles that come with being taken to have those features. And we can question the associated norms for playing those roles well. This is not to say that there could not be good justification for valuing certain features in certain contexts, but it opens up the possibility of questioning it. In many contexts, there may be reasons to value capacity to bear children, for example, or being exceptionally tall or good at programming. But what the deeply social picture offers us is the opportunity to ask not only for the explanation for why something is valued, but also its justification. And in many contexts, the justification is missing or spurious. So I hope you have a sense of the big picture. Let's now look at the theory. My aim in categories is to give a metaphysics of social categories of individuals, give a theory of what social categories are. The approach I take is to give a theory of the metaphysics of social categories by giving a theory of the social features of individuals. The social category is then the set of individuals who share that social feature. In this way, we push the question of what makes a category social onto the question what makes a feature of an individual social. As you probably gather, this involves a very thin notion of category. It really is just a set of individuals whose membership is determined by their having a certain feature. That sort of notion suits me just fine, but others might want to insist on some further criteria or perhaps reserve the notion of kind for categories that meet some further criteria. But back to the project, the first task is to give a theory of social features or properties of individuals. We all have various sorts of features or properties. Some are natural features, other relational, others social. What is it to have a social feature, and how does one get it? What is a social feature? To answer these questions, I make use of what I call a conferralist framework that I have developed elsewhere and tweak it for the use on social properties of individuals. I say that social properties of individuals are conferred. What does that mean? You may remember the moment in the Euthyphro where Socrates asks, is the action pious because it's loved by the gods? Or do the gods love the action because it's pious? The question is the nature of the property being pious. Is it dependent on the gods' love or not? Euthyphro initially maintains that the action is pious because it's loved by the gods, although he later succumbs to Socrates' view that the action is pious independently of the gods' love. In fact, that the gods come to love the action upon detecting that it is pious. I want to linger on this moment. Consider the idea that what makes an action pious is not something about the action itself, but rather about the gods, their likes and dislikes. And that's what I think about social features of individuals. Social features of individuals are first and foremost about other people, not the individuals who have them. And that is what the conferralist framework is to capture. But there's a disanalogy with the Euthyphro case. In that case, the gods are not constrained by anything in the conferral of the status of being pious. They're not trying to track anything or meet some standard. It is the pure exercise of power. And I think that in most cases of social features of individuals, the structure is a bit more complicated. Speaking of exercising power, many of you know the work on speech acts by Austin, Searle, Bach, and others. Austin identifies many ways we do things with words, including exercising a power and making verdicts. The sort of actions that I think are at issue in the construction of social categories are a bit of a mix of both. People are, knowingly or unknowingly, trying to track an independent feature But in so doing, they assign the person a status. And it is that status that is the social feature. Austin himself doesn't offer this. He is, of course, interested in the use of certain verbs as opposed to types of action, but let us put that aside. The main issue, though, is that he has these two types, exercitives, where you're exercising a power, and verdictives, where you're attempting to track a fact and render a verdict as to that fact. Austin's exercitives are divorced from the activity of attempting to track a fact, and the verdictives are oblivious to what happens when you issue the verdict, to the fact that when you issue your verdict, you're classifying or placing the individual, and then that classification has a life of its own. The conferralist framework is meant to capture these, but it's also broader in scope as it concerns all actions, not just discursive actions. For those of you who are wondering, using Searle's taxonomy of speech acts does not resolve the problem. You have the same kind of dichotomy there. There is another drawback in using the speech act framework to capture social features. I actually think it works well enough in the case of the conferral of an institutional status, as that is done once and for all. But many social features aren't institutional, and the conferral of them not just a one-time act, but more like an iteration or a standing attitude. How does a property get conferred? That depends on which property we're talking about, and the conferralist framework is an abstract schema that needs to be filled in for each property. One can use the conferralist framework to argue for a certain sort of subject dependency of any property, but in this project, I'm concerned solely with the social properties of individuals. These include being of a certain gender or race, and other features that define protected groups in various jurisdictions, but also any other human category defined by social property. The main idea is this: social properties of individuals are statuses that people have in the context they travel. These statuses consist in constraints and enablements on their behavior in that context. And these statuses are connected to other properties of individuals in a particular way. On the euthyphronic story, there are just two features: being loved by the gods and being pious. The conferralist framework complicates that picture a little bit by adding a base property or set of base properties that the conferrers are trying to track consciously or unconsciously. Not all conferred properties are associated with such base properties, but I believe that most social properties of individuals are. And in fact, that's where we get into muddle in various debates about social construction. Let me take an analogy. Consider the striker for the Icelandic national football team, Berglind, who scored the deciding goal against Hungary in the recent playoffs for the European Championships. Suppose the referee had called her offside. Then the team would not have advanced to the finals. What we have are two different features: the physical property of being situated inside enemy lines, or opponent's lines maybe, when receiving a pass, and the football property of being offside. But what's the relation between those two properties? On the conferralist story, the placement of the player and the ball does not determine or constitute being offside. It requires the judgment of the referee. The referee confers the property of being offside on the player. In doing the conferring, they're attempting to track the base property regarding the placement of the ball and the player. There are a couple of virtues of the conferralist framework for the football case. Because it is a two-tiered approach, it can account for conflicting intuitions. Berglind should not have been offside, but she was, perhaps. And it also captured what happens in the game, not what merely ought to have happened in the game. Both of these virtues are of prime importance when we use the conferralist framework to make sense of social features of individuals. I make a distinction between two such features: institutional and what I call communal. We have institutional features and institutional contexts. Such contexts are governed by a set of rules or laws. For example, laws governing driving in California, or rules governing the activities of the dolphin swimming and rowing club in San Francisco. The entities that confer an institutional status on a person in those contexts have the required institutional authority. For example, in the case of getting a license to drive in California, that status is conferred by an official of the Department of Motor Vehicles upon judging the person to meet the relevant prerequisites. People have the status as long as they remain in the institutional context and it doesn't get revoked. I'm going to share a slide so you see the profile of an institutional property, and it's a slide that also has the profile of the communal property. You see. So what you do, there are 5 things you specify. You are careful about which property you're talking about and who the person or entity or group in the case of institutional, that is in authority, that does the conferring. In the communal case, I call that they have a certain standing to perform the conferral. Then you specify what it is about the conferrers that does the conferring. In the case of institutional properties, it is an explicit conferral by means of a speech act or other public act. And in the communal case, it is explicit or implicit conferral by means of attitude or behavior. When does this happen? This happens under the appropriate circumstances. For instance, if you get conferred a degree, then it's at a commencement or something like that. And in each particular context that we travel, we go to a party, and that's a context. Even one room in a party, you go to the kitchen, that's a context. You go back to the living room, there may be a different context. Base property is the property that the conferrers are attempting to track in the conferral, and this can be conscious or unconscious. Stop sharing. I call the conferring of an institutional status on an individual an act of classifying that individual. The classification comes with deontic constraints and enablements, that is, with rights and privileges and the like. Associated are also norms for behavior in that institutional role. And the other sort of feature is what I call a communal one, although institutional and communal conferrals can interact in a variety of ways. A communal feature is a social status conferred upon a person in a context on the basis of them being taken to have a feature that is socially meaningful or salient in the context. The status consists in constraints and enablements, just like in the institutional context, but these constraints are not deontic. They don't concern rights, privileges, and obligations, but power, sway, and non-deontic restrictions. For example, being tall may be a socially important property in a context, and people taken to be tall deferred to or allowed to speak more than others. The base property for the conferral of a communal property can vary, as in the institutional case. Now, I won't go into more detail about the theory, but let us turn to the conferral of gender and sex. In my proposal for how to make sense of sex and gender and their relation, I aim to capture the type of social construction involved in the well-known feminist slogan, "Gender is the social significance of sex." You have Haslanger, for instance, subscribing to this slogan and wanting to give account of that type of social construction. For such a feminist, sex is biologically given and gender is social. For me, there's a twist. In fact, there are 3. Sex is not biologically given, gender is radically context dependent, and gender is not always the social significance of sex, but can be the social significance of something else. Let me start with the account of gender. Consider this scenario. You work as a coder in San Francisco. You go into your office where you are one of the guys. Some other people make the coffee. After work, you tag along with some friends at work to a bar. It is a very heteronormative space, and you're neither a guy nor a gal. You're another. You walk up the street to another bar where you're a butch and expected to buy drinks for the femmes. Then you head home to your grandmother's 80th birthday party where you help out in the kitchen with the other women while the man smokes cigars on the porch. In each of the contexts we travel, different features of us are socially salient. That is also true of gender contexts. In some contexts, people are trying to track sex assignment. In others, preferred role in societal organization, presentation of the body, preferred role in preparation of food, body parts related to biological reproduction, role in sexual partner, or identification with norms or positions. In many gender contexts, there may be a persistent assumption in the background that in tracking one of the base properties, sex assignment, identifying with certain norms, identifying with certain roles, role in biological reproduction, sexual role, any of those other things, we manage to track the other phenomena as well. But even if there are many contexts where this assumption is not misplaced, the presence of the many contexts where it is the wrong assumption shows the importance of keeping these various base properties apart, not only for a better theoretical understanding, but for practical reasons. In fact, a variety of feminist, queer, and trans theoretical work and activism has been aimed at challenging that assumption. It is for this reason that my own suggestion as to how gender is conferred makes gender be highly context dependent, and the base property or properties vary with context. On this view, not only is gender deeply context dependent when it comes to historical periods and geographic locations, but the same geographical location and time period can allow for radically different contexts, so that a person may count as of a certain gender in some contexts and not others. Now, the schema then would be you specify the genders. So there could be a woman, man, in some cases being trans is its own gender, in some cases genderqueer is its own gender. Some contexts, there's only two genders and either you're a man or a woman. In some context, being a trans woman is a woman. In other contexts, it's a trans woman is trans. So there are various kinds of contexts where because these are positions in contexts. Now, who is doing the conferring in these are communal categories, and what it is the other people in the context jointly with you when you are in that context are doing the conferring. What is it that's doing the conferring? It's the perception of the entities that are doing the conferring that the person have the base property for the conferral in the context. This happens in each and every context. And then the base property is whatever the feature is that people care about in that particular context. Now, that may be unjust. It may be unjust that they care about that feature in the context. But this sort of theory, the aim of that is to reveal that injustice so we can ask about how it should be different. Before we turn to the account of sex, let me note a couple of things. This is an account of how gender functions, not an account of how it ought to function. It's a social position account, but it is a radically contextual theory, which means that you may be of one gender in one context and another in another, because the base property for the conferral can vary from context to context. This may be uncomfortable. It may be unjust. This sort of account reveals the injustice in our gender practices. We can ask about a context, whether the presence of a certain base property merits the conferral of a gender status in that context. We can ask about whether that base property should be socially significant at all, whether its significance is outsized, and whether some other property should function as the base property for the conferral in the context. When we're engaged in activism and want our social world to be more just, we are trying to make future contexts just along these dimensions. Let's turn to sex. A host of recent work in biology by Anne Foster Sterling and others reveals that the biology supposedly supporting the division into two sexes is quite messy. If we look at three main ways of dividing people into sexes by functioning genitalia, or gametes, chromosomes, and hormonal levels, not only do these three methods not divide people into two neat groups, female and male, but the hard cases do not line up. Someone may not fit neatly into one of the categories according to one method, yet do so according to the others. The three ways of dividing people into sexes not only do not carve nature at some joint where you have female on one side and male on the other, these three methods of carving carve up different slices of nature. But carving is not only to be used metaphorically in this context. Even before voluntary sex change operations, newborns with ambiguous sex characteristics have been subject to the scalpel. Pastor Sterling estimates that somewhere around 1.7% of people are intersex according to one or other of the methods used. For these reasons, I want to give an account of the property of being of a certain sex as a conferred property where the aim is to track certain physical features, but where the resulting property is an institutional, in fact, a legal one. So there, the property is being female or male, and there are certain jurisdictions where you can be intersex or some other sex. It's a legal status. Who is doing the conferring? These are legal authorities drawing on the expert opinion of doctors or other medical personnel and parents. What is doing it? The recording of a sex in official documents on the basis of testimony of parents, doctors, and others. And in cases where you change sex, like in Iceland right now, the law has been changed, so you can yourself test to say that you want to be on a different sex assignment than you were assigned at birth. When does this happen? This happens at birth in the case of newborns and after surgery and hormonal treatment in the case of older individuals. Now, the base property or properties, the aim is to track as many sex stereotypical characteristics as possible. And doctors perform surgery in cases where that might help bring the physical characteristics more in line with the stereotype of male and female. There are a couple of things to note. The first thing is that I am drawing one wedge between the physical characteristics of individuals and how they get classified into sexes on the basis of those features. That's the sort of wedge we draw between what happens physically on a football or baseball field and what gets recorded in the score of a game as a result of the judgment of the referees or the umpires. But the sex case is even more complicated. There isn't just one base feature, but actually three sets of criteria that don't line up. Are you trying to track function genitalia or gamete production? Hormones, chromosomes, some combination. Some executive decision is made to count the individual with this group rather than that. But that is a social sorting mechanism used for social purposes, not biological. And that's when we have to stop and ask ourselves, what is this category for? What role does it play? And whose interests is it serving? In the case of sex, it isn't just the wedge between the presence of some physical property and then the social significance of having that feature in a context. No, there are three different potential base properties with potentially conflicting assigned statuses. In the case of sex, there is thus another wedge drawn between the physical situation and the social position. Now, some of you might protest. Sure, sex is a classification, but it's a biological classification. There are always problems with classifications, but these problems are just normal problems. They don't show that the classification is really a social status. Cats have sexes. Horses have sexes. Are you saying that the sex of a horse is really a social status? Although there are cases of horses having a social status, or at least almost, you may remember the story of Caligula trying to make his horse Incitatus a consul. I'm not saying that there cannot be other sex categories for other purposes, for example, in biology, or for that matter, if you breed horses. The sex classification there serves a predictive function. The prediction is not always borne out, of course. A mare may not always have a foal when paired with a stallion. But what function does the sex classification serve for us humans? Is it a mere predictive function about what ensues when you lock two individuals up in a stall? No, the role of the human sex classification is not just epistemic. I'm not denying that there can be statistically significant correlations related to clusters of various bodily parts that can be useful in predicting or explaining various things in biology or medicine. But I think we need to pull apart various notions of sex and recognize that the sex we all have and is recorded on our birth certificate and in our passports and driver's licenses and countless other documents is not really a biological feature. What gets recorded is our status in society, our legal status. And in many countries, that status comes with quite a number of legal constraints and enablements. Are you allowed to go to school, to drive, to own property? That depends on what sex assignment you have on a piece of paper, not what genitalia you have. The sex we have is related to physical features, but that relation is epistemic. Authorities are attempting to track the presence of various physical features in the assignment of sex. But the sex assignment itself, I submit, is a social status. What sorts of considerations are relevant to the question whether something is a social phenomenon or not? What would settle the matter, whether some feature of an individual was social or not? It isn't quite clear what to say about this, and you will be surprised to know that the philosophical literature on the topic that what makes something social isn't as rich as one would want. I have some more to say about this, but in the interest of time, let me leave that for now and focus instead on what is at stake. What is at stake in the question whether sex is a social phenomenon or biological? Why do we want a theory of sex as a social phenomenon as opposed to a biological phenomenon? One of the things that people found liberating about Simone de Beauvoir's work was the idea that whatever was going on with the biology, that did not determine social roles or social arrangements. We should ask ourselves what sorts of social roles and social arrangement we wanted. A wedge was drawn between the biological and the social. I want to draw another wedge, this time between the biological and the assignment into institutional, in fact, legal categories on the basis of best efforts to make sense of the biology. This feature of us, being female or male or some other sex, plays an outsized role in our lives and determines our life options. It is a classification and involves institutional constraints and enablements. Whatever is going on with our biology or body parts, once our bodies get classified in a certain way, all that matters for the institution is the classification, not the biology. And the classification then has a life of its own. Imagine opening up your passport. There it says that you are male, or that you're female, or that you're intersex, or whatever it says. This isn't a report of your bodily features. It's a report of the status you have in the society that issued the passport. We who want to end sex-based oppression need a good understanding of what of the world we live in is of our own making and what is not. And in this case, whether sex categorization is a social matter or reflects a natural distinction. If a category is a social category, that opens up the question to what extent it expresses societal values and interests that could be questioned. It has been a feminist staple to offer alternative explanations for phenomena that the larger culture insists is just a result of natural distinctions, processes, and forces. Here, I suggest that we think critically about the sex distinctions we live with and to what extent they express societal interests and values, as opposed to merely reflecting the natural order of things. Let us go back to what is at stake. In giving an account of gender and sex, we're looking for a theoretical understanding that can help us fight sex and gender oppression. Such oppression takes different forms in different corners of the world, as does how it interacts with other forms of oppression, such as racism, ethnocentrism, religious oppression, heterosexism, transphobia, disability, phobia, etc. An analysis of what is unjust when a trans woman in the UK is misgendered may not help illuminate the injustice faced by a person thrown into sexual slavery on the basis of being taken to a vagina. But we need our theory to be able to illuminate all these cases. And this is where a radically contextual account that is two-tiered is actually an asset. And now we come to my suggestions for how to navigate potentially conflicting interests. I call this strategy Ontic Descent. I think for many purposes, the gender and sex categories are really too coarse. They are shorthand for something else. And instead of the conferred gender or sex status, we should focus on the potential base properties. Consider the fights over who should get to be a woman in North America and the UK today. In many contexts I travel, people care about with what role in a gender hierarchy you identify. In other contexts, they care about your sex assignment, or they care about the body parts you have, or what have you. How are we to navigate these different demands? I suggest we take it down a notch. Ontic Descent as a strategy means that we don't focus our energies on the status, such as woman or female, but rather on the base property in each context. We ask whether that base property merits the treatment or procedure or service or protection in that context. The normative argument should happen on that level. For example, when you're a healthcare worker and are calling people in for a pregnancy checkup, the features that matter are not sex assignment or gender status. What matters is whether you're pregnant. You can be a cis woman or a trans man, agender, intersex, and a host of other things. It doesn't matter. What matters is your pregnancy. Another example is the AstraZeneca vaccine. Lots of countries are not administering it to women under the age of 55. I don't know about you, but that strikes me as a very euphemistic way of talking. Is it gender status of those affected what is at issue? Or perhaps it is people who menstruate, or people who have certain hormonal levels. Recently, the UK Commission on Human Medicines released a statement insisting there's no gender disparity, and the main indicator is age and a healthy immune system. Clearly, we need more refined categories for specific purposes. Gender and sex are just too crude. We need to focus on specific features that we think are relevant for the task, procedure, or protection at hand. Let us leave the status of being a woman or being female to the side and focus on features that may merit a certain protocol or protection. Now, you may say, you're not focusing on the most contentious issues. How about segregated bathrooms? Okay, I will address that. If we have bathrooms segregated by gender or sex, what is the rationale for it? Presumably, it is to protect vulnerable groups. What groups are these? Who are the people vulnerable to gender or sex-based violence? These include people who are taken to have vaginas, people who are feminine, people who identify with being a woman, people who are genderqueer in any way, people who appear to go against the ideological roles of women and men in their gender presentation or their sexuality. All these people are vulnerable to sex and gender-based violence, often death. All these people need protection. The justification for segregated bathrooms should focus on the features that have social significance in that context, which includes all of the features I mentioned and more. Having any of the features mentioned puts you at greater risk for violence. Then the question is how to address that. There can be many options. Unisex individual stalls is one. The title of this talk is What are gender and sex and what do we want them to be? I linked it at the beginning to conceptual engineering, and I think after my spiel about social categories being deeply social, you might think there's more of a link than I indicated, but we can leave that for the question period. I've given you a conception of what they are, but what do we want them to be? My answer is I want gender and sex to play a smaller role in our lives and world. And I think some of the conflicts over what gender and sex is and who gets to be or what gender and what sex can be better approached by de-escalating the conversation, by ceasing to focus on the conferred gender or sex status, and instead focus on the base property for the conferral in each context. This focus is the normative argument. I'm not saying that all disagreements would get solved this way, but at least it would be clear what the disagreement is about. And that would be a step in the right direction. De-escalation by Ontic Descent. Thank you.